Okay, welcome everyone. I am going to say initial words into the microphone to make sure that everyone can hear this. Yeah? Okay, volume is good. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for braving the epic weather and the challenges of the current transit strike to step out for this lecture by Professor Ingrid Waldron. And warmest welcome to Professor Waldron. Welcome to McGill and Jajaga, and I should say welcome back because Professor Waldron was here at McGill at one time, and I gather is originally from Montreal. I am Miranda Hickman, director of McGill's IGSF, the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, which is hosting this lecture today. And I'm pleased to note that this lecture is the first in what will be an annual public lecture hosted by McGill's IGSF. And the annual public lecture was established last year by my colleague, Natalie Stoljar, who was director of the IGSF. And we are delighted that Professor Ingrid Waldron was able to accept the invitation for this year's inaugural lecture. So thank you. And I want to extend thanks also to the team of people who have been vital to putting this event together today, including but not limited to Andrew Folco of McGill's IGSF, Charlotte Frank of the Department of English, Petros Saroudis of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, Professor Natalie Stoljar, Department of Philosophy and former director of McGill's IGSF, Professor Amber Rose Johnson of McGill's Department of English, and Professor Noelani Arista, director of the Faculty of Arts Institute for Indigenous Research and Knowledges at McGill, about which Professor Arista will say something further in a moment. And then before ceding the microphone to colleagues, I would like to acknowledge that we are located on unceded Indigenous lands on the traditional territory of the Ganyankahaga, one of the founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Ganyankahaga are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jajaga, also known as Montreal, is known historically as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the community of Jajaga. So as we begin, I'd also like to note that the lecture and proceedings today are being recorded, or the lecture portion of the event is being recorded. So if there are any questions and concerns about the recording, please be in touch with me or with Charlotte Frank. And I'll close my segment with a passage from a poem by the American poet Muriel Rukeyser from the 1930s, from the Book of the Dead, which was her long poem, an expose of an industrial disaster and an environmental disaster affecting communities in West Virginia in the 1930s, when workers, many of them migrant workers who couldn't say no to a job, 75% of whom were Black, were mining for silica, lucrative silica, without protection, without masks, without proper drilling methods, and hundreds of workers, as a result, died from silicosis, the disease of the lungs contracted from inhaling the silica dust that spread everywhere, that was everywhere in the air and in the water. There was something in the water. And at one point, Rukeyser's poem comments on the water as a force, as a source of knowledge, and as a life-giving power when it is free of the dust and the pollutants that have contaminated it. This is a perfect fluid, having no age nor hours, surviving scarless, unaltered, loving rest, willing to run forever to find its peace in equal seas, in currents of still glass. It knows its seasons, the waiting, the sudden. It changes. It does not die. So with that, let me turn things over to my colleague Noelani Arista to say a little bit about FAIRC, the Faculty of Arts Institute for Indigenous Research and Knowledges that is co-sponsoring the event today. And thank you very much to FAIRC. I will mention also that because of the transit strike, it's understood that some people may have to step away after the talk today because the timing is challenging. So thanks very much. So let me turn things over to Noelani. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. Aloha mai kako, mai ka la pukai, ganawage a I ka mole o le hua. Aloha mai kako. When we say hello, we say hello from where the sun rises in the east. So now that I'm orienting myself here from Jojage, that would be the easternmost reserve here in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the track of the sun all the way to the westernmost islands of Hawaii. And when we look at that pathway of the sun, we include everyone in that greeting. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak just a little bit about the newly approved Faculty Arts Institute for Indigenous Research and Knowledges, which is informed by the conception of Indigenous studies as the scholarly study of Indigenous knowledge systems and experiences which are plural and internally diverse, and which have for far too long been suppressed by the colonial disqualification of these knowledges and the associated Eurocentrism of many contemporary academic disciplines. The commitment of Indigenous studies in arts is to set a foundation for research into Indigenous knowledges and experiences in Canada and across the world, where deepening knowledge of the local is enhanced by global comparative frameworks within the three curricular foci of the Institute: land, language, and governance, which make the foundation for sovereignty and indigeneity. And with that, I'd like to thank you. Also, we are very pleased at the Institute to always support talks like this one. And in the future, certainly, as long as I'm director, that is going to be the approach. So thank you so much for inviting me here. Aloha.
On a podcast episode that Dr. Waldron guest appeared on just a few weeks ago, she describes this work of illuminating the structural nature of environmental racism and amplifying the efforts towards environmental justice as her purpose. Like the child in Alice Walker's definition of womanism who asks grown-up questions, Dr. Waldron recounted asking her mother at the age of 14, "Why are we all here?" and cites this question as an early and persistent quest for her purpose. She told listeners that it took a long time to figure this out, and that actually this project came to her, was gifted to her. In 2012, after finishing degrees in psychology and intercultural education, in sociology and equity studies in education, it was a local environmental activist in Halifax who encouraged her to do a project continuing the work that he and his colleagues had been so committed to. And the story continues to a groundbreaking book, to a major discovery of that book by a future collaborator, and then a documentary that made its way to Netflix, all the way to forms of federal policy approved just last year. This is to say that Dr. Waldron is a scholar walking and working in alignment. What remains most exciting to me about her work is that it's not just about her voice, her research, her efforts alone. In the documentary and in her scholarship, we see and hear the voices of many who have been dedicated to working against environmental racism and working for environmental justice for decades. Dr. Waldron uses her position to amplify the voices of folks like those who we heard yesterday, and shout out to the small group of us who came and braved the cold to watch that really important documentary. Those like in the documentary Miss Louise, a community member from Shelburne, an advocate and community keeper in her Black community in Nova Scotia, and the grassroots grandmothers who organized relentlessly against the building of a pipeline through their sacred riverways. All night and all morning, I kept rehearing a prophecy given that soon enough, if we do not care for this earth, an ounce of water will cost more than an ounce of gold. And how important that we are gathering today at the start of the climate conference of parties, a world gathering for the largest global climate negotiations. And today, when communities, I'm thinking especially of the Philippines and Jamaica, under floodwaters from major typhoons and hurricanes, and where massive efforts of deforestation from the Amazon to Atlanta kill required ecosystems and harm Black and Indigenous communities, where unending pollution and vulnerability in Palestine and Congo, and the list can continue, thinking of the many elsewheres and also the many right heres where racialized people are vulnerable, especially to the forces of colonialism, and in racism. And here at a university that continues to struggle to work in genuine consultation and collaboration with Indigenous communities, let all of us commit in this moment to the work of listening and to the work of action. And we can begin with listening right here and right now. Dr. Ingrid Waldron is a professor and Hope Chair in Peace and Health in Global Peace and Social Justice Studies in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University. Her research focuses on environmental and climate justice in Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities, mental illness and dementia in Black communities, and the impact of COVID-19 in Black and South Asian communities. Dr. Waldron is the author of the book, There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, which was turned into a 2020 Netflix documentary of the same name. She is the founder and director of the Enrich Project, which stands for Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequalities, and Community Health Project, and helped develop the Federal Private Members Bill, the National Strategy Respecting Environmental Racism and Environmental Justice, Bill C-226, which was approved at Senate and given royal assent on June 20th, 2024, becoming the very first environmental justice law in Canada. Dr. Waldron's most recent book is entitled From Enlightenment to Black Lives Matter, The Impact of Racial Trauma on Mental Health in Black Communities, and it was published almost a year to date. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ingrid Waldron.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I got my BA in psychology at McGill, and I was born in Montreal, so I'm always excited to come here. And thank you for coming out. I really didn't expect anyone to come because of the weather, so I'm a bit shocked. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about my journey, and it has been a journey conducting this project. Lots of challenges, but a lot of great things have happened through this project that have been really meaningful. I'm also going to highlight some of the women I've met over the years who have been on the front lines of environmental justice organizing, and end with some of the efforts I've made over the years to try to address this issue. But I want to begin with a quote from Vanessa Gray, an Indigenous environmental activist from Andromong First Nation. She said, "The land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women." Indigenous and Black women have been building grassroots environmental and social justice movements for decades to challenge the legal, political, and corporate agendas that sanction and enable environmental racism and other forms of colonial violence in their communities. Gender, race, class, and other social identities render Indigenous and Black women more susceptible and vulnerable to a web of inequalities that inflict violence on their bodies, their lands, and their communities. Colonial gendered violence continues today and includes the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the displacement of Indigenous people from their lands by corporate resource extraction projects, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police violence, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence that make it difficult for Indigenous and Black people and women to meet their basic needs with respect to employment, income, health care, and other resources. Colonization and genocide are tied to the intersections of Indigenous lands and bodies. Women experience violence because they are the ones who are responsible for taking care of the land and holding it for future generations. Therefore, gendered violence that harms women specifically also harms nations, which makes it much easier to take possession of the land. For Indigenous women specifically, production and reproduction, land and life, and resistance and survival are all intimately connected. There is no separation. Therefore, the Indigenous role in fighting against environmental racism by defending their land and territory and protecting their water are acts of resistance against gendered oppression. Here's James Desmond, who I had the honor of meeting back in 2013. He died about 2 years ago, but this was probably the first true blue environmental activist I met. He's an African Nova Scotian man from the community of Lincolnville. And at that time, I had started my project, and I thought the best way to start the project was to start to develop relationships with African Nova Scotian and Mi'kmaq people. That's the Indigenous people of Nova Scotia. I had no relationships with these communities, and I knew that this project needed to be community-based, and that meant that I needed to meet with the folks, and I needed them to tell me what my research questions and objectives should be, which is very different from what we typically do as academics, right? We often put in our ethics and we go right ahead, we develop our research questions, but I knew that this, of course, had to be different. During that meeting, these meetings I was holding with Indigenous and Black African Nova Scotian communities, when I ended up in Lincolnville, we were also filming a documentary at that time. It's called In Whose Backyard, that you can find on my website. I wanted to ask James Desmond how he defined environmental racism, because when I started the project, there were a lot of people in Nova Scotia who were incredibly dubious about what I was doing. They were skeptical. They were kind of dismissive. They thought the term environmental racism made no sense, which, I certainly understood. It was a term I didn't understand until I read more about the issue and I realized it was structural. But I wanted someone on film, a community member, to define it. And I love the way James defined it because it's so succinct and simple, but yet it integrates the core components of the broader definition of environmental racism, the more academic definition that I will show you later. So what is environmental racism? How do we define it? So this is how the late James Desmond defined it. He says, the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism? It's environmental racism to its core. There's a more academic definition by Dr. Robert Bullard. He's an African-American professor teaching at a university in Texas. And he's considered to be the father of environmental justice. His first book came out around 1990 called Dumping in Dixie. And here is his more academic definition of environmental racism, which in many ways aligns with what James Desmond said. He says environmental racism is racial discrimination in the disproportionate location or siting of industrial polluters in primarily Indigenous and other racialized communities. Environmental racism is racial discrimination in the lack of political power that these communities have for resisting the placement of these industries in their communities. Environmental racism is racial discrimination in the differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities. And finally, environmental racism is exclusion of Indigenous and other racialized communities historically from environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. I think I forgot one, policies. Environmental racism is racism in the policies. The policies are actually what is structural about this issue, because across Canada we have environmental departments that are creating policies that in a way make decisions about where polluting industry should go. So when we see the spatial patterning of industries primarily in Indigenous and Black communities, that's a result of policy and decision making and environmental assessments. And for some reason, they always seem to end up in Indigenous communities, particularly. There's always a pipeline in an Indigenous community. And that has to do with how we make decisions about which communities get what. And that's through policy. So that's the more academic and inclusive definition of environmental racism from Dr. Bullard, who I had the pleasure of meeting. He's a bit of a hero, of course. I met him back in 2017. I held a symposium in Halifax when I was living there. I was teaching at Dalhousie, and I invited quite a few of my environmental heroes to that symposium, and he was one. So I want to provide a few case studies of environmental racism. This is not the gamut. There are more cases, but these are case studies I think some of you may know about. And I know many of the women on the front line, so I thought I would highlight the fantastic work that they've been doing over the years. Indigenous and Black women have been on the front lines of environmental justice organizing in Canada for decades, as we know. So I want to highlight them. First is a good friend, Doreen Bernard, in the community of Sabaga-Nagadi First Nation in Nova Scotia. Between 2014 and 2020, Doreen, as a member of the Grassroots Grandmothers, and the other women who are members of the Grassroots Grandmothers have been on the front lines to fight, to oppose the implementation of a brine discharge pipeline by Alton Gas into their community, specifically into the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. Thankfully, that brine discharge pipeline project finally closed in 2021. It was a 7-year fight. It took a long time, but Doreen and her colleagues did a great job in terms of halting this project. They halted it quite a few times throughout those 7 years, and it finally closed. Alton Gas packed up and left. They said something about moving on to other projects, but I really believe that the community was so strong in how they fought against this project that in the end, I think Alton Gas gave up. What I loved about this community is that they used social media and they used in-person events to resist this pipeline, and they were successful in engaging the general public in Nova Scotia. They were often in the news. They got a lot of allies. People will come up to the community to learn about Indigenous issues, learn about environmental racism. They used their social media to great effect, asking for help and support and funds. And, there were GoFundMe pages, and, they were looking at legal cases, and they needed help from the community, and they were successful in engaging the community because they were so welcoming. So to me, even though it took 7 years, this was, of course, ended successfully. Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia. Chief Andrea Paul was at the forefront of efforts to address environmental racism in this community. Between 1967 and 2020, a pulp mill had been dumping effluent or wastewater into Boat Harbor. Boat Harbor was a pristine hunting and fishing ground for the Mi'kmaq community in Pictou Landing First Nation, and then 1967, this pulp mill started dumping effluent into Boat Harbor. It became a cocktail of toxins. Over the years, community members would say that it's contributed to high rates of cancer and respiratory illnesses and skin rashes, etc. And cancer. The mill was closed at the end of January 2020. The government announced that it needed to close because the government admitted that they had made broken promises over the years to the community. They kept saying that they would close it, they never did. And they finally closed it at the end of January 2020. The community is currently going through cleanup. So there's a cleanup project happening right now in the community. But I think, once again, the efforts of Andrea Paul and Michelle Francis Denny and other members of the community had a lot to do with that closure. You've probably heard of Amjinwang First Nation near Sarnia, Ontario, often referred to as Chemical Valley, which says a lot. Vanessa Gray is a young activist I've gotten to know who's been doing such a fantastic job trying to address this issue in her community. This is considered to be Canada's, I believe it still is, largest petrochemical complex, grouping over 60 petrochemical facilities within a 25 square kilometer area, which the community says is linked to high rates of cancer, reproductive illnesses, and other health issues in this community. The community is now working with government, the Climate Change, Environment and Climate Change Canada, to deal with air pollution. The policy department at Climate Change Canada is a person by the name of Amanda Morfortin, is leading a strategy to address the issues in this community. You may have also heard of Wet'suwet'en First Nation. This is Marlene Hale. I believe she's from Montreal. She's a chef, I believe, but she's also an activist and has been a strong advocate for environmental justice in the Wet'suwet'en First Nation to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation who are opposed to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project near their community in northern British Columbia. What I've found over the years is a lot of people don't realize that Black communities also experience environmental racism. Many of them, for whatever reason, in Nova Scotia. I haven't been able to really figure out why. I know that I spent some time in Montreal on sabbatical a few years ago, and people kept telling me about a pipeline in Montreal Nord, in Montreal North, which is close to the Haitian community. I tried to find more information about it, but I didn't. So, but for whatever reason, I feel like there are many examples in Nova Scotia, and it may have something to do with invisibility. African Nova Scotians tend to be located in isolated, mostly rural areas, unlike Black folks in other parts of Canada. And rurality, living in isolated communities, compounds the discrimination that individuals can face. So they're dealing with racism, of course. They're dealing with low income, low education, but they're also living in rural and semi-rural environments that are very isolated. We know that rural and isolated environments are ignored. They're ignored by policymakers. They don't seem to matter to anyone. And you could put a dangerous industry there and nobody would know. And the community may not fight back because they don't think people care. So that's something that I've come up with in a way for African Nova Scotians and why there are several cases there. I think the nature of their communities, the isolation, has a lot to do with it. You may have heard of Africville. Africville is an example of gentrification, or what we call urban revitalization and environmental racism. On the screen, you see Denise Allen. She's a longtime activist around environmental racism in Africville. She's been advocating specifically for reparations for the former residents of Africville, which is now a former African Nova Scotian community. The residents, the descendants are, some of them still alive, but the community is no more. They dealt with, as I said, expropriation and gentrification. They were basically pushed out of their community amidst an urban renewal campaign that the city of Halifax engaged in the late 60s. This resulted in the community becoming, so this is where it's environmental racism. Amidst that urban renewal campaign or gentrification or the pushing out of the community, at the same time, what happened was that industrial development left a lot of environmental and social hazards in the community. And these hazards included a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. And if you talk to the residents today, they feel the mental health impacts of all of that, and they keep rising. You know, I attended a talk a few months ago where there's now another push by the descendants of Africville to demand reparations from 3 levels of government in Nova Scotia. There was a march back in 2020. Every few years, they rise up again demanding reparations and acknowledgement. Lincolnville. You saw a photo of James Desmond earlier. He defined environmental racism. This is Mary Desmond. She's not related to James, happens to have the same name. Desmond is a very popular name in the African Nova Scotian community. Mary Desmond has fought alongside James for decades to address the first and second generation landfills that were sited near to her African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. The first generation landfill was put there in 1974. And just when the community thought there was traction and that landfill would be removed, what a slap in the face when the municipality placed a second generation landfill over the first one in 2006. When I met with James in 2013 for that workshop I mentioned, he showed me a letter that he had sent to the municipality that went unanswered for a year. So they were being ignored. And to this day, the landfills are still there. I highly doubt it will ever be moved. It's also there with a degraded liner, which worsens things in terms of the contaminants that are going into the ground. And the community has said over the years that these landfills have contributed to increasing rates of cancer in their community. If you watched my Netflix documentary, you would have met Louise Delisle. She's a treat. I love Louise. She's a true blue activist, loves her community. I was hiring a position for someone to do focus groups. I was doing a study on the health effects of environmental racism in African Nova Scotian community, and I wanted someone to do focus groups. I didn't want to do them. I wanted a community leader that was known and trusted to have them start to lead, right? With community-based research, you want to identify community members who can lead, not having the academics do everything. So I posted an job ad at the Black Loyalist Heritage Center, I believe, and Louise answered that job ad. She came to my office and she said, "Ingrid, are you saying that what we've been dealing with has been environmental racism?" She never heard of it. Environmental racism. I said, well, environmental racism is not just about Shelburne. It's about a pattern. It's about a pattern across Canada in the Indigenous and Black communities. So yeah, what you have been experiencing is one case study of a pattern. And what shocked me when she sat down, she said to me, "Oh, about 98% of the people in my community have cancer," which I didn't believe. I thought I've never heard of any community where almost everyone has cancer. And then I remember I read this, was it a New York Times article a while back? There is a community in the United States, is it in Louisiana? It was called Cancer Alley. African Americans who were near, just like Amjunwang First Nation, polluting industries, and so many of them had cancer. And I thought, it's possible. So I started slowly to believe Louise. After a while, she would send me a message on Facebook through the years telling me that this person had died. And Ingrid, remember this guy? Oh, he died last week. It was coming every week. It was upsetting. Eventually she stopped, but it was, yeah, it was really upsetting to hear so many people who were dying, people that I had met. So I believe her now that this is a problem. And they have high rates of cancer, specifically high rates of multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. The dump, so this is different from Lincolnville. Lincolnville has a landfill. A landfill has a liner. A dump has no liner, therefore more dangerous. So what's near to Shelburne is a dump that has been there since the early 1940s. And the community would say that everything and anything went into that dump. Syringes and material from the hospital, from the military base, animals. They would say everything was put into that dump. So they're seeing the effects in terms of extremely high cancer rates and, for a small community, perhaps high rates of multiple myeloma. So I've talked a lot about health, and when we talk about your greater risk for health impacts if you are living close to environmental hazards, the term we use is environmental health inequities. And environmental health inequities across racial dimensions have been well documented in the Canadian literature over the years, which provides very strong evidence that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities in Canada are exposed to greater health risks compared to white communities because they are more likely to be spatially clustered around waste disposal sites and other environmental hazards. A really great researcher who does health work on environmental racism is Dr. Jeffrey Masuda. He's at the University of Victoria now. I believe, yeah, he left Queen's. He was at Queen's. So he's at the University of Victoria, does some great work on the health effects of environmental racism. The environmental hazards may include sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, and ozone. And the studies focus on the link between environmental hazards and health, and they have found that the most common health risks associated with polluting industries and other projects include cancer, respiratory disease, congenital anomalies, cardiovascular disease, skin diseases and allergies, etc. We also have to put mental health in there. I think mental health is often excluded. In working with many of these communities, there are certainly mental health impacts, the stressors of living near to a dump. I did a study specifically on Shelburne and Lincolnville asking about the mental health impacts, and Louise and others in her community mentioned that the men in Shelburne and the young people struggle. The men, many of them are dealing with addiction, substance dependence, and she believes that it's partly due to the stigma of living near to the dump and the stress of the health effects associated with the dump, including cancer. So while I think the psychosocial stressors related to environmental hazards are often not focused on, is something that I like to focus on in my research as somebody who's very interested in mental health and trauma. So environmental racism is about race, yes, but it's intersectional. It's about race, gender, class, geography. Geography in terms of many of these communities live on reserves, or they live, as I said, like African Nova Scotians, in rural or isolated areas. We have to have an intersectional framework to understand experiences of environmental racism and its social, political, and health impacts. So it's really important to understand it also as a gendered issue. It's not only racialized, and certainly the health effects are not only racialized, but they're also gendered. And this means that that intersectional framework will tell us a lot about how specifically, I would say, Indigenous women are impacted by environmental racism. Indigenous women, through the detrimental health effects of toxic contaminants on their reproductive health, including preterm births, low birth weights, small size for gestational age, and intrauterine growth. There's a 2025 report, fantastic report, I don't think I've seen anything like this. A 2025 report entitled Cradle to Grave, the Health Toll of Fossil Fuels and the Imperative for a Just Transition. This was written by the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and they found that during the prenatal period, vital organs are forming. Exposure to pollutants from coal, oil, and gas extraction and combustion are linked to low birth rate, preterm birth, miscarriage, and a range of congenital abnormalities. And many of these health harms are permanent, impairing a child throughout their lifetime. So when I like to talk about the gendered impacts of environmental racism, I often point to the health impacts that are often experienced by Indigenous women and Black women. But it's also about the fact that these women are on the front lines. They're experiencing the burdens of dealing with this issue. And for Indigenous women, they would say it's part of their role. I started wondering about this, and I remember when you saw Doreen Bernard earlier, the Mi'kmaq woman from the Grassroots Grandmothers. I went to her and I said, Doreen, why is it that I always see women from your community on the front lines out here? Whenever I'm out with the marches, etc., I always see women. Well, where are the men? And she gave me a really good answer, which now I understand. She said, Ingrid, we're not bitter. Our men help us. They help us in different ways. Because we see ourselves as life givers, we are life givers. We're responsible for future generations because we give birth. We see ourselves as, we see this as our role as Indigenous women to protect the water and the land. So we're not bitter, and our men help us in other ways. So that clarified things for me, because I was noticing when I would, even with certainly the Black community, always women on the front lines, and I do sometimes wonder what stress, how does this impact the psyche to have to deal with this issue? And this is an issue, environmental racism, where it's 2 steps forward, 4 steps backwards. You know, sometimes you make gains and then you got to start again, and it's extremely stressful. So, as I mentioned, I founded the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project back in 2012. As Amber mentioned, I didn't do it willingly. An activist came to me and introduced this term environmental racism to me, and I was extremely hesitant. I was someone who had done my PhD in Black women's mental health, my psychology degree, my undergrad at McGill. I thought I was going to do research on Black women's mental health. That was my passion. And I didn't see this coming. Someone at a health clinic said, if you're looking for someone to do a project on environmental racism, you might want to try Dr. Ingrid Waldron. Have you heard of her? And the activist, Dave Ron, said, nope. So he looked at my website, called me up, and he came inside of my office and introduced the term to me. I was extremely hesitant. I said to myself, I'm not taking this on. And then when I thought a little bit about it, I said, it is a health project. I'm interested in health, of course. It's an opportunity to get to know the Mi'kmaq community. I felt like I didn't know them at all. It was an opportunity to get to know the African Nova Scotian community, despite the fact that we shared similar race. I had no connections to the African Nova Scotian community, and I thought their history was very interesting. It was very different. I'm Caribbean heritage, so our history is very different, and I thought, intriguing. The health part I like, getting to know Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotians I like, but the environmental part I don't, because I don't know anything about the environment. And I thought to myself, don't you have to be an environmental scientist to do this? Somebody's going to call me out. They're going to say, why is Ingrid Waldron doing this? She doesn't know anything. So I was scared. That's the truth. I was scared to do this. I thought someone would call me out. And then I thought a bit about it, and I said, well, I'm a sociologist, and I can maybe put a different spin on this. Maybe I don't know anything about pollutants and contaminants, but I know something about racism, colonialism, capitalism, sociological concepts that sociologists are great at, gender, all of these intersections. Maybe I can do something different. I can't do that, but maybe I can do this. So I thought about it a bit, and I said to this activist, I said, okay, I will take it on. And there we go. So in 2012, I believe I got a team development grant. And that's when I went down to the Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities to get to know them and to ask them what they thought my research objectives should be. The Enrich Project over the years has been multidisciplinary, multi-partnered, multimedia, intersectional, multi-approach, which I'll share with you a little bit later. I've had so many different types of people on board. I've learned from this project not to say no just because somebody's discipline is so different from mine. Doesn't mean that I should count them out. I've already learned that. I had a hydrogeologist sit down in my office to propose a project, and right in the beginning, I thought, well, what do I have in common with a hydrogeologist? I'm a social scientist. I don't know where it would fit. And thank God I said yes to him because I'll talk about the project later. So who's been in my project? Environmental scientists, planners, activists, of course, researchers and faculty, health professionals, government, politicians, educators, artists, all to examine the ecological, health, political, and social impacts of environmental racism and later climate justice through a community-based, as I said, multi-method, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and multimedia approach. As I said earlier, there was a lot of doubt in Nova Scotia about what I was doing. I remember reading a Chronicle Herald newspaper article when they printed the comments below, and there was a feature article on me, and somebody wrote a comment, said, what is Dr. Waldron coming up with? What is she going to do next? Is she going to do a project on environmental sexism? Which I thought was funny, but that just shows you the lack of confidence in what I was doing, and they thought it was crazy. And I'm playing the race card. Dr. Waldron is just trying to find something to do around race, and there was an attitude that this wasn't real. So I thought to myself, how do I get people to understand this, to maybe understand the structural underpinnings of this? If they, on the surface, environmental racism sounds weird. How can the environment be racist? Which is what I thought when I was asked to take it on. But I said to myself, I have to do awareness raising that allows people to understand the structural underpinnings, policy of environmental racism. I did so many events in Nova Scotia. Awareness raising was so important. It seems pretty benign, but I think it's one of the reasons we now have an environmental justice law in Canada, is because I've done so much work trying to raise awareness through different types of events. This is probably still my favorite event from 2015 when the new library opened in Halifax. They were so proud of that library. I think a Scandinavian, a Swedish architect built that library. And I said to myself, I got to get into that library because I thought the library was so beautiful. So I said, I have to have an event there. And this is the typical, events that we have. We want people from different perspectives. Here's Lenore Zan, who I co-developed the new environmental justice law with. We've got activists. Here's Mary Desmond. Lynn Jones is a very well-known activist in the African Nova Scotian community. Doreen Bernard from the Grassroots Grandmothers, and Carolyn, I forgot Carolyn's last name, she's from government. So trying to get people on a panel, of course, to share different perspectives on the issue. So I've had multiple events, symposiums, workshops, seminars, attending conferences to present, etc., just to get the word out, to get people to understand what the issue is. Multimedia has been very important, right? Understanding, like somebody who's an advertisement or in marketing, that people want to receive information in different ways. Not everyone wants to read my book or journal articles. People want to receive information in different ways. So who am I targeting? How will I move that person? How will I mobilize them? That's part of our work as knowledge translators or engaged in knowledge mobilizing as faculty members. We talk all the time about knowledge mobilization. How do you make knowledge work in a way that it has a good impact? So multimedia is one of those ways. Some people like to receive information in very creative ways, and I have engaged with multimedia because I love creativity. This is Nova Scotia born actor Elliot Page. So the story of this is very long, but I connected with Elliot on Twitter probably around October 2018. My book had come out in April, and Elliot had read my book. Somebody suggested he read it. Before he read my book, he read a book called The Mill by Joan Baxter. Joan Baxter is a popular journalist, and Joan Baxter wrote a book called The Mill about Pictou Landing First Nation, the mill that was dumping effluent into Boat Harbor. And I think somebody suggested that Elliot read my book. Elliot did and got excited and then put my book onto the co-director of the film, Ian Daniel. He didn't understand why Elliot was making a big fuss. You know, he's hearing Halifax, didn't know much about Halifax. He was hearing environmental racism, and he said he wasn't that interested. But Elliot was making a big deal, and he read the book, and he also enjoyed it. So I noticed Elliot on my Twitter one morning, didn't think anything of it, didn't think it was the actor. And I just kind of shrugged my shoulders and I went away. 4 weeks later, lots of activity on my Twitter, the same Elliot person. And I said to myself, is this Elliot Page who I saw in that movie Juno and Inception? I said, yeah, it is. And I said, well, he's promoting my Enrich project, promoting my book, supporting the women on the front lines. I have got to reach out and thank him. And I DM'd him on Twitter and I said, I really want to thank you for all you're doing. And he said, I'm just trying to use my platform, my celebrity, to help. And I then mentioned this to a friend of mine who was on an environmental committee with me. What is her name? I don't remember. But she owned a restaurant called the Wooden Monkey in Halifax. And she said, oh, I've known Elliot for like 15 years. You want me to put you in touch? I said, yes. So we all had, at the end of 2018, a three-way call with Elliot, myself, and the other woman saying, what should we do? How can we help? And that then turned into another call in January of 2019. At that time, in 2019, we settled on an idea, which would be a film. And Elliot came up to Halifax around April 13th of 2019 to film for about 6 days, came to my condo, filmed me first, and then went out to the communities and filmed them because I had suggested certain people. We didn't get anybody, unfortunately, from Lincolnville. I think they were elderly, but I think probably a little shy. And it was not supposed to be anything glamorous. A small camera with her co-director, Ian Daniel, and his co-director Ian Daniel and his personal assistant. That was it. Nothing glamorous, small camera. And then they went back to edit and cut, and they invited me to be a co-producer, which I was really happy about. So that included suggesting cuts in the film, music, getting people on board, of course, to be filmed. And then we were thinking, I went to Elliot's mother's home to see the full film, and I see people crying, and I see how emotional it is. Because at that time we thought it's a film that we would cut into pieces and post on Twitter. And I was the one who said, I think this is too emotional to just cut it up into pieces. I really think we need a long form, full length documentary. And everybody said, you really? You think that's a good idea? I said, yeah, I think this issue is too important. And we need something full form. People are crying in the film, and we said we want to make an impact. What better way to make an impact than to do a 1 hour documentary? And then I started going off about film festivals. And we could put it to the Toronto International Film Festival and the Berlin Film Festival and Robert Redford's Film Festival. I kept going because I love film festivals. And I used to volunteer at the Toronto International Film Festival way back, right? So I got excited, and they said, okay. And surprisingly, they listened, and they submitted it to the Toronto International Film Festival very late. Don't say anything, but I think it was past the deadline. But Elliot's friend was Cameron Bailey, who's, I believe, the head of the film festival. And we got in. And this is us at the Toronto International Film Festival, the Elgin Theatre on Yonge Street in Toronto on September 9th. And Elliot was kind enough to bring members of my family down and members of Dalhousie, the VP research and other individuals really kind of begged me, they wanted to come, so they came as well. Yeah, the VP of research is really excited. So a few people came from Dalhousie and got free tickets. Yeah. So that's us there. Many of the activists I mentioned earlier, right there. In late October, I was hearing rumblings that it might go to Netflix. I was walking with Elliot to a Japanese restaurant with Ian Daniel. And at that time, Elliot said to me, I think I'm hearing it's going to go to Netflix, but I'm not sure. And at that time, the Umbrella Academy, Elliot's new show, had just debuted. And I thought to myself, well, Elliot has some kind of power. He can get into the room in a way because he's got the Umbrella Academy. So I was hoping. And then I heard later, yes, it's going to Netflix. And it did go to Netflix, of course, at the end of March 29th, just after COVID hit. Lots of people watching TV at that time. And at the same time it went to Netflix, it went to, which I think is still there, Apple TV, Microsoft, Xbox, and Amazon Prime, I think still there. So this has been exciting, of course, for an academic like myself, somebody who just put out a first book and the book was turned into documentary. This was a great time. And talk about knowledge mobilizing. During the film festival, I had interviews with the Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine, Entertainment Weekly, the Canadian television entertainment show, Entertainment Tonight Canada, and so many other shows I don't remember. What knowledge mobilization, right? I mean, this is an issue that so many people don't know anything about, and that opportunity to share this work with individuals was so exciting. Running during the film festival, running in my high heels from different media outlets. It was crazy. One of the best times of my life. So for me, media is really important. I continue to engage in all forms of media. People want to hear about this topic. People say to me all the time, not a lot of people know about this. But I don't know. I get so many emails to talk about this. I have a new book out, as you know, on mental health and trauma. I get calls for that in podcasts. People want to hear about this more. They still want to talk about the documentary. They're screening the documentary. It's how many years old? I don't know, 5 years. So I continue to do podcasts, television, newspaper interviews, etc., radio, to talk about environmental racism, because I know there's always going to be somebody who doesn't understand it. And this just helps to mobilize people. Of course, I'm an academic, so I've got to do research. And much of that is community-based, ensuring that community members are leading the work, having them do the interviews or focus groups, getting trusted members of the community to lead. One of the projects that I'm doing now is extremely interesting because it's so multidisciplinary. We've got an architect on board, a planner, a nurse, a statistician. I'm a sociologist. Who else? A toxicologist. What we're trying to look at is why there are such high rates of cancer in Shelburne. And we're looking at it from different perspectives. Lifestyle, including diet, exercise, etc. The dump, so what's in the dump. Number 3, the structural determinants of health, race, gender, class. And number 4, African ancestry. So I have a biologist, I forgot her name, a biologist on board from McMaster University, Julia Daniel, whose focus, her research focus is cancer in Black women. And she's known to have discovered this gene called the KISO gene, I believe, in Black women. So she's looking at whether or not there's some kind of genetic component to the high rates of cancer in the Black community in Shelburne. So this is exciting. The focus groups and interviews have been done. That was my piece. We're waiting for the DNA samples to come in that the biologists have done. We have a biologist also from Dalhousie. So it's a big team, very interdisciplinary. We're looking at the DNA samples right now to see what the results are, and then they will write it up in. They're telling me they're seeing something strange. I said to them, you better make sure that what you find is accurate because the media will be on this. But they're seeing something strange in terms of the high cancer rates. I don't know what that is yet. This is the town hall that we had in Shelburne in 2023 to introduce the community to the study and get them engaged. So publications have been, of course, part of what I've done, publishing in journals, and of course, publishing my book. The journals have been environmental sociology, environmental justice, health, slightly interdisciplinary, right? So I'm looking at climate change now too, and that is the cover of my book upon which the documentary was based. I was lucky to get a quote from Eliot. Part of my work is also about community capacity building. I'm not somebody who wants to go into communities, take from them and say, bye, see you next time. These community members are still my friends. I still invite them to do talks, but I also want to build capacity. I want to hone their skills. Many ways I do that, but one way that I've done that is through water testing. In 2018 in Lincolnville and later in Shelburne, I did water testing projects with that hydrogeologist. So the hydrogeologist came into play because he's the one who sat in my office and said, I think you should do water testing. And I remember saying to him, what do I know about water testing? I'm a sociologist. And he says, well, I'm a hydrogeologist and I can lead a project with you on water testing. And we did it. And thank God I didn't say no to him because this to me is one of my best projects. It's tangible. It gives something back to the communities, not just about research. As I said, we did water testing projects in Shelburne and Lincolnville. We trained environmental science students to test water and to lead water testing projects. We trained the community to test water. What we are doing is testing water in any rural Nova Scotian community, not just Black or Indigenous. And even though I'm no longer in Nova Scotia, the projects continue through a nonprofit that I co-founded with the hydrogeologist and an environmental science professor at Nova Scotia Community College. Our organization is called Rural Water Watch, and it continues today. The hydrogeologist now has these annual well water days, educating people about the harms of well water that can be contaminated, how to keep your wells healthy, make sure that they're not old and contaminated. So this is done every year. We bring in speakers. We do things online to educate the Nova Scotian public. I'm really proud of this because it's tangible, it's giving back. I mean, do the community members care that much about our books and our journal articles? Probably not. Maybe politely they would say yes, but this allows me to really give back because it's tangible. So I love this. I've moved into climate change recently. This was something else that I was scared of when I started to notice that climate change is becoming increasingly important and I can't keep ignoring it. Just keep doing my environmental racism and not connecting it to climate change because they're connected, although they're different. So I said to myself, I've got to start to do some climate justice work because I'm seeing how important this is. So I've moved into climate justice probably around 2021. I would say that perhaps the majority of my projects right now is in climate justice. I'm doing a climate justice workshops in Toronto and Hamilton. I'm doing a big one in Nova Scotia. I look at why Black communities specifically are disproportionately exposed to climate devastation because of race, income, gender, disability, age, where they live, the neighborhoods they live in tend to be, of course, lower income neighborhoods because disproportionately Black Canadians are lower income or poor, meaning that they will more likely be living in housing that's poor quality, neighborhoods that don't have public infrastructure that is strong public infrastructure for many reasons. So this is what I'm trying to kind of highlight through my projects. I'm doing it through workshops. I'm doing workshops right now. The last one will be November 13th in Toronto. I'm also doing a climate justice project, a big one in Nova Scotia. And a lot of it has to do with environmental education. So I did workshops in 25 African Nova Scotian communities between 2023 and 2024. I got a big grant from the Nova Scotia Department of Environment that I did not ask for. It came out of the blue at the end of 2023. 3. I was shocked. I think this has something to do with the fact that when I left Nova Scotia, like, I think it's hard for them to find someone who is Black who's doing this work in Nova Scotia. I didn't meet too many people who were Black in Nova Scotia doing work on environmental racism. I think when I left, maybe it was hard for them to find someone because they gave me a whole bunch of money that I didn't ask for. Just like that. That's never happened to me before. I've usually had to apply for a grant. So what I decided to do was 25 workshops, and I'm also currently doing an online module on climate justice, specifically for African Nova Scotians. So 12 monthly modules that began in September will end in August of next year. I have an African Nova Scotian leader who's facilitating these modules. I had a filmmaker who curated short videos for the modules, podcasts for the modules, and an hour documentary on climate change for the project. So this has been very exciting. And the people who participated in the workshops are now called ambassadors. So they're participating in the modules. Now they're responsible for handing down that information as ambassadors to their community. So this is extremely exciting for me to do this kind of work and to have this kind of education online for African Nova Scotians, many of whom this is a new topic for them. But they're learning how interconnected climate change is to their daily lives. I think there's been apathy in the past for Black communities because, saying to themselves, what does this have to do with me? What does climate change have to do with me? And I felt that way. How is it relevant? And one of the things I wanted to do during my workshops and through these modules is to show them how relevant it is. Climate change is not just about climate change. Climate change is about housing. It's about neighborhoods. It's about income. It's about race. It's about food security. It's about public infrastructure. It's about transportation. This is what we're looking at for these modules and in the workshops. And now people are starting to see, African Nova Scotians, it is relevant to me. It does have something to do with my daily life. So that is my goal, to make them understand that it is relevant, it is important, and that they have to build capacity and preparedness around climate change. Leaving you on a high note. So, since 2015, Lenore Zan, who I showed you earlier in the pink suit, we've been trying to develop an environmental justice private members bill. Well, we did develop it for Nova Scotia only in 2015, and it never passed into law. She put it forward every year, 2015, 2016, 2017, 18, never passed into law in Nova Scotia. So Lenore moved over to the Liberal Party MP in around 2018. And in 2020, just before COVID, she said, Ingrid, what do you think about us taking that 2015 Nova Scotia private members bill we developed and turning it into a federal bill? And I said, yes, this is great. That means we can deal with all the pipelines and Indigenous communities across Canada. We're not restricted to Nova Scotia. I said to her, this is fantastic. So we worked on improving that 2015 Nova Scotia bill. We did that in 2020 early. And on February 26, 2020, she introduced it in the House of Commons. And then, as you know, in 2021, we had a snap election and she lost her seat in Nova Scotia, no longer a politician. She's now back acting. She was an actress before she became a politician. She's a voice of Rogue. If you know X-Men animated series, she's a voice of Rogue. She recently put out a book. She's been on all those American television cop shows. I've seen her. Yeah, she was an actress. She acted on stage, and she's from Australia. So we put it forward, but then she lost her seat. And then the private members bill, it died. When a snap election is called, all private members bills die on the order paper. So I said to her, what now? We've been doing this since 2015. What do we do next? She said, I'm hearing rumblings that Elizabeth May might want to sponsor this bill. We had a Zoom call with Elizabeth May, 3 of us, and I urged Elizabeth to take this on. And Elizabeth said, well, Ingrid, I've got this transportation bill I really want to put forward. I don't know if I want to take on this environmental racism bill. And I said, please, can you take it on? She said, well, I'll only do it if I know you will support me. And I said, yes, I will definitely support you. We've been supporting of this bill through campaigns online, petitions, sending letters to politicians. I will do the same for you, I promise. She said, okay, I will take on your bill. So she reintroduced it after Lenore introduced it in February 2022. And like with Lenore, it went all the way through Parliament. And then it went to Senate. And I was shocked. Probably at the end of 2023. I thought, maybe this has a chance. I couldn't believe it. Then 2024 comes, June. And the bill's at third reading at Senate. And I was a witness. You can have 5 minutes as a witness to just speak to the bill. So a lot of people spoke to the bill. I did that on Zoom. And next thing I hear, it passed. It passed on June 13th, well, not officially. So on June 13th, 2024, it passed third reading. But on June 20th, 2024, it was given what's called royal assent. And when a bill is given royal assent, it becomes law. So on June 20, 2024, that bill I co-developed with Lenore became Canada's first ever environmental justice law, starting off as Bill C-226. As part of that law, there's a new national environmental justice strategy that Amanda Monforton of the Policy Department of Environment and Climate Change is leading. And that includes engaging with communities across Canada on environmental racism, writing a report, creating awareness, and then presenting that report, I believe is next year, to government to review. So that national strategy is going on right now. They've already met with Amjin Wong, I know, in March, and they're planning to meet with Shelburne. I don't know which other communities they're meeting with, but that's part of this law. So for the first time, I would say government has truly been consulting with communities. I've consulted as much as I can. I'm just one person, but the government has never consulted with communities in this way. But this is part of that bill. It's a requirement, and that bill looks at the intersection of race, socioeconomic status, environmental hazards, and health. Perfect combination. This is what I've been looking for, and I'm very excited about the possible outcomes of this bill. So I just want to leave you on a high note. Here is Senate. I had a chance to have dinner with Elizabeth May after the bill was passed. I actually, don't tell anyone, I sat in the chair. You know, the House Speaker? I sat in the chair. I felt like a bad girl. But it was my first time in Senate, so I was just roaming around looking at everything. And so I'm trying right now to support in any way I can. I'm not leading this national environmental justice strategy, but I'm there if the government needs me, and I want to help communities who want to present their case to government, helping them write a report or amplifying their message. I want to be involved in some way. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening. This has been a fun ride for me.